JUANITA Constable, Senior Advocate for Climate and Health at NRDC, LARA Skinner, Director of the Labor Leading on Climate Initiative at the ILR Worker Institute at Cornell University, Ji-Sung Park, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at UCLA, and our own CHRISTIE MERINO of Ceres, will explore the latest research on how the climate crisis is changing behavior habits, health outcomes, and work structures for employees. They'll examine what's happening with the most vulnerable workers and sectors and look at proactive solutions from the investor, policymaker, and corporate perspectives. Thank you, and over to you, CHRISTIE.
Welcome, everyone. My name is CHRISTIE MERINO, and I'm representing Ceres today. And it is my pleasure today to bring you this session on how the climate crisis is changing the future of work. If you've been able to tune into the Ceres conference panel discussions over the last few days, you've heard a significant focus on how companies and investors can double down and accelerate their progress to creating a more just and inclusive economy. We at Ceres published the Ceres 2030 Roadmap this past October to put a line in the sand for what our expectations are of our stakeholders to uphold this promise and create a better future. And the conversations that we've had over these last few days and really over the last year throughout the pandemic have underscored the severity of the situation we're in, and that action that appropriately accounts for people has lacked integration, resulting in patchwork solutions. So today, I'm delighted to focus our conversation on one of these cross-cutting risks and some possible solutions. Given the impacts of climate change and how they have already impacted our lives today, we're going to be discussing how future impacts are projected to increase in severity and impact workers in the future of work. So we're going to be talking about resiliency and the protection of people in a more specific way. So to help get this conversation going, I'm joined by three esteemed colleagues today, and they're going to kick off our panel. I'm joined by Dr. LARA Skinner, JUANITA Constable, and Ji-Sung Park. You can read more about these speakers just directly below the video with their bio links and some of their resources today. And feel free to also utilize the chat function to ask your questions for a short moderated Q&A section, which we'll conclude with. I'll now turn it over to LARA.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me participate in today's event. My name is LARA Skinner. I'm the director of the Labor Leading on Climate program at the Worker Institute at Cornell University. We sit within the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. When I think about the climate crisis, I think about the scale and urgency of the crisis and how it's likely the most critical issue of our time. I also think about how the climate crisis is not just an environmental issue, but that it also has significant social, labor, employment, and economic impacts. And I also think about the other major crises that we're currently facing, the crisis of inequality. And I mean inequality of income, wealth, power, race, opportunity, and how most of the new jobs that are created in our economy today are often low wage, lower quality, more precarious jobs. So indeed, we're facing two crises at this point in history, and three if you count COVID. And we know that the climate crisis exacerbates existing inequalities, and it hurts working people, people of color, women, immigrants, the elderly, the most vulnerable in our society first and worst. So if we don't design solutions to the climate crisis that deal with inequality, this transition to a low carbon, more sustainable economy will actually exacerbate inequality, making our society one of the most unequal in history, at a time when many Americans report struggling to meet their basic household needs. What we want are solutions to the climate crisis that help address and reduce inequality. We want to combat the climate crisis, and we want to reverse inequality simultaneously. And when I say that the climate crisis has significant social, economic, labor, and employment implications, I want to give a couple concrete examples. For example, extreme heat waves will affect workers' ability to labor outside in the summer. And our next panelist will talk more about this. Workers are also on the front lines of dealing with extreme weather events. And I saw this in Hurricane Sandy. And when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, as many of you know, our most important infrastructure, our roads, our hospitals, our transportation systems, our airports, our water and wastewater treatment facilities, power plants, Our major urban areas are often located along waterways and coastlines that are jeopardized when storms and flooding from extreme weather events hit. And it was during Hurricane Sandy that we saw most clearly that workers are on the front line of responding to extreme weather events. It was nurses who were carrying patients downstairs when the power went out at hospitals and their elevators didn't work. It was transit workers who were getting buses and trains to safety and away from flooding. The other thing to keep in mind is that climate-fueled extreme weather events cause billions of dollars in damage, significantly impacts our economy and our public budgets, and they often close down businesses as well, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, which means workers are temporarily unemployed or permanently laid off as well. The other aspect of the economic, labor, and employment implications of climate change are related to how we address the climate crisis and reduce emissions. 97% of the world's climate scientists agree that we need to get to a net zero emissions economy by 2050, probably 2045. And this means a major transformation of our economy and how we produce and consume things. We have to electrify and retrofit all of our buildings. We have to massively expand and improve our public transit systems. We have to electrify our whole transportation sector. We need to figure out how to decarbonize our industrial and manufacturing sectors. This means that we will produce the building blocks of our economy, concrete, steel, plastics, in a decarbonized way. We'll do it without producing emissions. And some of these things we don't know how to do yet. So this is a massive transformation of our economy, and it means some sectors will grow while others decline. We know that jobs will be created, but we also know that jobs will be lost. Nearly 7 million people in the US currently work in the energy sector. That's a lot of jobs and a lot of families that depend on those jobs. So the big question for me is, how do we make this transition to a clean energy economy, to a more sustainable, ecologically friendly economy in a fair and equitable way? And part of this is that we just need to have a really good understanding of the social, labor, employment, and economic impacts of this transition. We need to map it out and study the potential impacts. The other piece is to make sure that this new clean energy economy is fair and equitable, and that it doesn't replicate the existing inequalities in our current economy. And a big part of this is making sure these new jobs are high quality, family and community sustaining jobs. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing so far. Solar and wind installation jobs have been the fastest growing jobs in the country, but there's a real concern around the quality of these jobs. Only 3 to 4% are union. If you look at the traditional fossil fuel sector, particularly in power generation, 10 to 14% are typically union. This means that workers in the traditional fossil fuel sector could easily make $30,000 to $40,000 more per year than folks who are working in the solar, wind, or energy efficiency industry. And then finally, I'll just mention that the other big piece of how we make this transition is making sure that we're investing in communities that need it most, frontline and historically disadvantaged communities. So to close, I would just say, I think we're presented with a major challenge and a major opportunity. Can we build this robust, equitable, and fair clean energy economy based on high quality, good jobs? And will we focus our efforts and investments on frontline and historically disadvantaged communities that can benefit most from this new clean energy economy that we're trying to build? Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Juanita Constable, and I'm a senior advocate for climate and health at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'm going to be echoing a lot of Dr. Skinner's great points, but let's start first with a bit of a thought exercise. I'd like you to take a minute to imagine that you cut sugar cane for a living. When you get to the fields in the morning, it's more than 80 degrees Fahrenheit. By early afternoon, it's more than 105 degrees. You're wearing a head covering, gloves, long sleeves, and tall boots, which all help protect you from the sun and your own machete, but it makes you feel so much hotter. Over the next 12 hours, you make more than 3,500 machete cuts and do the physical equivalent of more than 3,000 push-ups. There's no shade and there's never enough clean water to drink. But you get paid by the ton, so you're pretty reluctant to take breaks, even if you start to feel sick to your stomach and dizzy from the heat. At the end of the day, you go back to a communal bunkhouse provided by your employer. But is there air conditioning? Nope. It's a hot, crowded space and you have trouble sleeping. The next morning you wake up still tired, still heat stressed, and still dehydrated from the day before. Now, a happy ending to this story would be that you keep working with few or minor health problems. The less happy ending is what happens to hundreds of thousands or possibly millions of people worldwide every year. Their stories end with debilitating illnesses such as chronic kidney disease, disfiguring injuries associated with sweaty, slippery hands, or even death from heat stroke, a heart attack, or more than 24 other potentially deadly outcomes linked to heat. Now, extreme heat has always been a problem for workers, but climate change is making it worse. Multi-day heat waves have become more frequent, severe, and longer. And climate change is raising the baseline temperature, turning winter into spring, spring into summer, and summer into a furnace. Farm workers, construction workers, and others who do strenuous labor outside are clearly among the most vulnerable to heat. But climate change is also making conditions more dangerous for indoor workplaces without sufficient cooling or air filtration. This includes places like warehouses, kitchens, and even airplanes stuck on the tarmac. In 2015, for example, 60% of more than 300 garment workers surveyed in Los Angeles reported excessively hot and dusty conditions in their factories. And of course, extreme heat isn't the only workplace hazard worsened by climate change. There's wildfire smoke, which can exacerbate asthma and potentially contribute to lung cancer among firefighters and first responders. There's a heightened risk of accidents at oil and gas facilities as hurricanes sweep over coastal areas. There's increased exposure to infectious diseases carried by everything from mosquitoes to dust that has fungus in it to contaminated floodwaters. And there's the accumulated mental health trauma of working at one disaster scene after another, year after year, with shorter and shorter breaks in between. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't offered you a lot of quantitative data, and that's because we simply don't have a good handle within the US, let alone elsewhere, of the full occupational health and safety toll of climate change. There's lots of reasons for that, including underreporting by workers and employers, but our public and occupational health tracking systems also weren't set up for a climate-disrupted world. I know that that kind of uncertainty about the scope and scale of the problem can make it harder for companies like yours to plan. But if there is one thing you take away from my segment, I hope it's this. As Dr. Skinner said, climate change isn't just a corporate sustainability problem. It's not just about reducing emissions. It's about the health and the safety of your direct employees and those in your supply chains. It's about what you do to ensure those workers, wherever they're located in the world, keep bringing their best, healthiest selves to their job every day and get home in one piece. Protecting workers from climate change is fully within our grasp, but it's only going to get harder and more expensive the longer we wait to act. So the time to act is now. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for joining us today. Once again, my name is Ji-Sung Park, and I'm an environmental and labor economist and an assistant professor at UCLA. And I wanted to start by reiterating perhaps a not so familiar dimension of what is by now a familiar stylized fact, which is that we've got a lot of warming coming down the pike. For example, over the next 20 to 30 years alone, there are some parts of the United States that are expected to experience over 50 additional days per year above 90 degrees Fahrenheit on top of what has already been the case. And while everything I and the other speakers have been talking about today has been predicated on the premise of strong mitigation efforts, I think it's worth being upfront about the fact that at least through mid-century, much of this warming is already baked into the system, right, irrespective of mitigation. And so we might want to be thinking about adaptation and mitigation simultaneously, right? This warming comes amid a backdrop of growing economic inequality, particularly along dimensions of educational attainment, what economists call human capital. And there's now growing evidence that whether it's globalization or automation or even the recent COVID-19 pandemic, the economic fallout of such shocks appear to be borne increasingly heavily by individuals with lower levels of human capital, particularly non-college workers and underrepresented minorities. Now, when it comes to climate, some of the work that my team and I have been able to do recently suggests that these workers, underrepresented minorities and workers without a bachelor's degree, are significantly more likely, in the case of non-BA workers, for example, 4 times more likely to spend a significant fraction of their workday potentially exposed to climate risk, either working outdoors or indoors without air conditioning. This means that they likely face far greater risks to life and livelihood than those higher up on the income distribution. Now, as Juanita suggested, right, understanding what this means for workplace safety in a comprehensive sense is non-trivially challenging, but thanks in part to advances in data analytics and what we in the social sciences call causal inference, which is just a fancy way of saying lining up the data in such a way that you can make stronger claims about causality, because it's as if nature herself is running a series of experiments. We've been able to uncover some new and important phenomena that complement many of these surveys and anecdotal reports that we've had to work with so far. For instance, in a recent project, my colleagues and I are teaming up with the California state government to link over 11 million workers' compensation claims for workplace injuries to daily weather data at the local level, the upshot of which is that, again, we're able to set up a series of natural experiments that otherwise would be wholly unethical, but that nature herself has been running over time, that allow us to make much stronger claims about causality and understand the breadth of the problem more comprehensively. What we've been finding has been, in some cases, quite surprising and sobering. For instance, in California, we find that a day with high temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit increases same-day injury risk by up to 10% in some industries. But interestingly, the vast majority of these cases are not officially tagged as being heat-related, heat exhaustion, heat illness. They're actually for ostensibly unrelated things like falling off of a ladder, being hit by a moving crane, dropping a hazardous substance on yourself, right? And moreover, we find that it's not just for outdoor workers, the construction and agricultural workers of the world, but also for workers in many indoor industries, specifically manufacturing, warehousing, and wholesale. And all told, over the past 2 decades, we estimate that hotter temperature may have caused upwards of 80,000 additional workplace injuries in that period. Let me just conclude by noting that this is part of a growing wave of similar economic research really coming online just in the past 4 or 5 years, which suggests that in addition to these significant health consequences and worker safety impacts of heat, the productivity effects of heat may also be a significant risk to the bottom line and possibly to macroeconomic stability, if you believe a recent report by the IMF. I'd be happy to talk about the specifics during the Q&A. Let me just end by echoing the remarks of our 2 former speakers, saying that, you know, being a leader in climate probably means more now than just cutting emissions, although that, again, is essential. It may mean being very proactive about getting ahead of the adaptation curve, right, on behalf of all a company's stakeholders, including a company's most vulnerable workers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for sharing those insights. I am definitely feeling the urgency and just the passion for the research and advocacy that you all are doing with frontline workers today. So for our Q&A section, Juanita, I would love to start with you, if that's all right. You know, we've heard a lot of talk over the last several weeks, obviously, and even in the last couple of hours, really, at the Ceres conference here, about the Biden administration and about their, you know, whole of government approach to climate change. And I'm curious if you could share with us, you know, what are some of your hopes in terms of what you hope to see for worker health and safety at OSHA in particular? And, you know, what sorts of implications do you see that having on the private sector moving forward?
Sure. Thanks for that great question, CHRISTIE. So I want to see 2 things from OSHA, recognizing that they have their hands full with COVID and still have a lot of work to do on that. But in parallel, I'd like to see OSHA and every other federal agency update its climate adaptation plan. The federal agencies have plans dating back from 2014 or so. Things have changed a lot. So how does climate change affect OSHA's ability to deliver or to meet its mission and to make sure its own workers are safe? But even more pressingly, in the near term, I'd like to see a heat safety standard for indoor and outdoor workers across the country. There's a patchwork of protections right now. And I think that regulations, while that may strike some fear into hearts, in this case would provide a lot of certainty for companies that are trying to navigate what's actually a more complicated problem than it seems. You'd think it'd be easy to protect people from heat, but there's a lot of individual and social and other factors that make it tricky.
Yeah, that's a great point, Juanita. And I'm wondering, Ji-sung, if I could turn to you. I think that you identified this a little bit in your talk as well, but just the data and the lack of, that cohesive data for companies to really start to grasp this issue and be able to effectively manage it. I'm wondering if you agree, with some of the points that Juanita just made about what OSHA's role and the federal government's role could be in this moving forward, but then also, what sorts of things can companies do in the interim as we're, awaiting that long process?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I couldn't agree more with all the points that Juanita raised. I mean, just in terms of data, right? Data is the lifeblood of any public policy response. And in this case, for a variety of reasons, we're still lacking on many dimensions in terms of systematic data collection. To give OSHA some credit, they've got a lot of fires to put out, so to speak. And historically, the level of funding and human resourcing, let's just say, has not necessarily kept up with the challenges, especially in terms of the growing risks of climate change. Specifically to your question, I'm not sure. There are some databases currently publicly available. The Bureau of Labor Statistics comes to mind. But as Juanita pointed out, when it comes to the effect of heat on workers, so much of it depends on the context, not only the specific geography. Even within Los Angeles, for example, you may have a heat wave. It's 80 degrees in Santa Monica. It's 120 degrees, 20 miles, to the west. So that level of spatial granularity is going to matter. But also what's going to matter is granularity in terms of the operational structure and the kinds of occupations, right? Are you in a big warehouse where you have a lot of heavy machinery operating, or are you in a smaller area where, even a window air conditioner could help? These kinds of details, I'm afraid to say at the moment, is going to be up to individual companies, to my knowledge, to gather that kind of information, to get a better handle on how big of a problem this is. And I don't want to open another Pandora's box, but the word supply chain came up. That's going to be something to think about as well. The US has hot places, but if you think about the world as a whole, there are much hotter areas where this may be an even larger problem, and where the institutional infrastructure of, say, an OSHA may not be as available. Thinking proactively about what parts of your supply chain may be exposed to this kind of risk, I'm not going to suggest is an easy thing to do, but maybe worth considering sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Ji-sung. No, definitely not an easy task, but a necessary one for us all to start to, wrap our heads around. Lara, I would love to invite you to come into the conversation as well and to answer that first question.
Yeah, CHRISTIE, I thought your first question around Biden's whole government approach to this work was a great one. And I can really sort of speak to that at a policy level as someone who works at the intersection of climate and labor and employment issues. I've been really excited to hear about Biden's vision for this whole government approach. And I think it really means, from a policy perspective, he's taking a comprehensive, holistic, intersectional approach to tackling climate change, which is, what we really need. For example, I think one of the greatest commitments that he's made is to funnel 40% of climate investments to frontline communities who have been most impacted by climate change, pollution, and extreme weather events. And that includes frontline workers. So I think there's some real opportunities for companies in that regard as well. And then I think he's really thinking about how to maximize job creation and high quality job creation through government procurements and investments in the clean energy sector. He's looking at transitioning the whole federal vehicle fleet. At the same time, he wants to use that purchasing power to make sure that we're purchasing electric vehicles that have been manufactured in the US, by companies that have committed to wage standards and labor policy that's going to ensure that these are high quality jobs. And there's a bunch of other examples, but I think that sort of whole government, very comprehensive, holistic approach makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, great insights, Lara, especially from where you sit, engaging policymakers and union leaders and organizers as well at that intersection of the solutions that will, get us to where we need to go. And I know that everyone has really identified in their talks just before that, this problem is quite large, obviously, and there's a lot of localized solutions that really need to happen to ensure, equitable protection for workers in the long term. But I'm wondering, especially for the companies and investors that are tuning in with us today, if we can all take a step into their shoes and try to sort of identify some of those first scenarios, I hate to use this phrase, but just low-hanging fruit solutions that companies can begin to tackle in the short term to really start that conversation moving forward. I'm not sure, Juanita, if I could turn over to you again to begin with that, and then we can move through the panel.
Sure. Just to return to the example of heat again, there's the basics: shade, water, rest, and training programs, which right now a lot of employers aren't doing. I'd really love to see employers create worker-based and unions, if it's a union workplace, safety committees, so that workers are directly informing what employers are going to do to keep them safe. They know the work, they know how to keep themselves safe.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Lara, I'm not sure if there's anything you'd like to add to that question, or Ji-Sung as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Juanita. I think I'm always so impressed when I do training and education work with workers and community members, how much they know about climate change and how much they've already been impacted by it. We did a recent survey in New York State, and 76% of New York State residents said that they had been impacted by climate change in the past year. So I just think there's so much we can learn from the folks who are on the ground, looking at a company's operations and processes. What can you do to make them more energy efficient, more low carbon? So much we can learn from that knowledge. And then I just think there's so much we can do, in terms of, our businesses located in places where we can use public transit, which is a big part of reducing emissions. Can folks walk or bike to work? Can you encourage the use of public transit? Can you install electric vehicle charging stations? All of this, I think, is part of how we make this transition together.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of the above, and I don't have too much more of insight to add other than to suggest, although this may not be such a low-hanging fruit, that company culture probably matters in terms of workers' willingness to raise this issue. I mean, in the workers' comp data and some of the work on workplace injuries that I'm familiar with, there's a suggestion that there's a high degree of underreporting, and that level of underreporting will vary considerably depending on what the atmosphere of the workplace is like. And so there are many shades of gray between simple compliance and outright exploitation, where the workers may or may not feel safe to just raise a concern. Hey, can we just install a shade structure here? It would help us a lot. Or that kind of communication, I would imagine, is probably a function of company culture around these issues.
Yeah, such a great insight, Ji-Sung, and reminds me again of another theme that we heard earlier today from the employee activism panel as well, that company culture is just so important in that, and that obviously starts with leadership as well. So just an important reminder for folks on the line today. And getting at, one of the questions that someone asked through the chat about any good examples of how companies are listening to workers in this conversation. I know that, Lara, you have a lot of experience doing this in New York State, specifically with the application of, policymakers and labor union organizers, and coming together to create the climate jobs program and recommendations. And I'm just curious, very quickly, if you feel like that sort of engagement model could be similarly applied to just a corporate structure moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in a lot of unionized workplaces, there are occupational health and safety reps, who for many years have been making improvements and making suggestions for improvements in their workplaces. The UK is actually trialing a model of green workplace reps. And that's something that I'd like to see us try in the US, have workplace reps who are focused, like I said before, on what can we do within our own company, with our own operations to improve energy efficiency and address climate change.
Yeah, wonderful insight as well from what's happening in other countries, lessons learned that we can bring back to the US as well. Knowing that we are unfortunately about out of time, I just want to take a moment to thank the panelists so much for your time and your expertise today. Definitely encourage folks to connect with the panelists as they see fit to follow up and also engage, with the materials that are attached to the session description today, some of the reports that our panelists have authored in the past, and feel free to engage with those recommendations and really bring this back to, to your roles within your companies. So thank you all very much and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.